Hello everyone, welcome to week 5, lesson 5 of world history at Horizon University. Today we're going to begin talking about the rise of Islam. Now think about the setting of Islam, where it first began, in the deserts of Arabia. So imagine that you are crossing the desert in a long caravan of camels that are laden with cargoes of rare goods. Imagine that there is sand everywhere in the desert, and there's an occasional oasis that consists of a spring with a trickle of greenish water and a few palm trees. And as you move on, you eventually come to a bigger oasis where there's a whole town of white, cube-shaped houses inhabited by men that you can tell are warriors. And they gallop across the desert on their swift horses. They rob caravans and fight each other. And so there's a constant conflict of oasis against oasis, town against town, and tribe against tribe. So it was in this strange desert land of Arabia, with its few warlike inhabitants, that an extraordinary series of events took place that we're going to talk about today. Around the year 600, so roughly 600 years after Christ was born, when the monks were teaching simple peasants and the Merovingian kings were ruling over the Franks in what is today France, nobody talked about Arabs. They were busy galloping around the desert, living in tents, and fighting each other. They had a simple faith. Like the Babylonians, they worshipped the stars. They also had a stone that they believed fell from heaven. And this lay in the shrine of the Kaaba in the oasis town of Mecca. And Arabs often made pilgrimages across the desert to pray at this shrine. At that time, there was a man in Mecca named Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. And this is a sort of artistic representation of what he may have looked like. His father was of high birth, but was not wealthy, and he was a member of a family that was charged with watching over the shrine of the Kaaba. Muhammad's father died young, leaving his son with only 5 camels, which was not very much at that time in that place. And Muhammad's mother then also died when he was 6 years old, and he had to leave the desert encampment where he lived with the other children that were born of men of high rank. He earned his living tending goats for those who were wealthy. Later, he married a rich widow, and he made great journeys in her service as a camel driver, leading trading caravans across the desert. He married this woman, and they lived happily together and had 6 children. He also adopted his young cousin, Ali. Now Muhammad was strong and vigorous, and he was highly respected. He became known as the trustworthy one. He had shown an early interest in questions of religion, and he enjoyed talking with Arab pilgrims who came to the shrine in Mecca, as well as Christians from the region known as Abyssinia, which is today Ethiopia. And he also enjoyed talking with Jews. There were actually large numbers of Jews in Arabian oasis towns at this time. And as he learned, or as he talked to them, he was impressed by this doctrine of the one invisible, mighty God, which both Christians and Jews spoke of. He enjoyed hearing about Bible figures like Abraham and Joseph, and about Jesus and Mary. And he reported that one day when he was on a journey, he had a vision, which is a kind of dream that people supposedly have when they're actually awake. But in this vision, it seemed to Muhammad that the angel Gabriel appeared before him and spoke to him in a loud voice, telling him to read. But Muhammad protested that he could not read. But the angel continued to tell him to read. And the angel commanded him to pray in the name of the Lord his God. He was profoundly shaken by this vision. So for 3 years, we'll move on to page 2 if you're following along in the notes. For 3 years, as he journeyed back and forth across the desert, he reflected on this experience. He then reported having another vision in which the angel Gabriel appeared before him in a blaze of heavenly light. He was terrified and he ran home and lay trembling on his bed. But as he lay there, he heard the voice again, which commanded him, "Rise and give warning, and honor your God." Muhammad believed that this was God's message, that he must warn humankind about hell and proclaim the greatness of the one invisible God. He believed he was the prophet, through whose mouth God would make known his wishes to humanity. In Mecca, he preached the doctrine of the one Almighty God, the supreme judge, who had appointed Muhammad to be his messenger. But most people laughed at him. Only his wife and a few relatives had faith in him. However, the priests of the Kaaba, who were the leading tribesmen, saw Muhammad as a dangerous enemy. They forbade anyone in Mecca to associate with Muhammad's family or to do business with his followers. And this must have meant that there were years of hardship for his family and friends because of this. However, Muhammad had met some pilgrims from an oasis town that had long been at conflict with Mecca. And by the way, this is a picture of Mecca, and there in the middle you see the shrine of the Kaaba. This is modern Mecca. You can see all the Muslims, the great number of Muslims gathered there in modern times for a pilgrimage. Okay, so Muhammad met these pilgrims from an oasis town that was in conflict with Mecca. And in that town there were many Jews. And this meant that these Arabs in these towns already knew about the teaching of there being only one God, because they would have learned this from the Jews. And so they were more open, and they actually listened to Muhammad's preaching. And the news that Muhammad was preaching to these hostile tribes and that his popularity with them was growing made the guardians of the Kaaba furious, and they resolved to execute Muhammad for treason. Muhammad had already sent his followers out of Mecca to the desert town that had befriended him. When assassins entered his house to kill him, he climbed out of a back window and fled to join his followers. This flight is known as the immigration, or in Arabic it's called the Hijra. It took place in the year 622. Muhammad's followers have counted the years from this date, just as Christians came to count the years from the date of the birth of Christ. So Muhammad was given a warm welcome in the town to which he fled, which would later be named Medina, or the city of the Prophet. In Medina, Muhammad set about instructing his followers, who listened to him attentively. He explained how God had revealed himself to Abraham and to Moses. God had preached to humankind through Christ, but now God had chosen Muhammad to be his prophet. he taught them that they should fear nothing and no one but God, or Allah, the Arabic word for God. He also taught that their fate had been ordained by God. What must be, and the hour of our death has been appointed from the day of our birth. So God has already decided all things by his will. We must surrender ourselves to the will of God. In Arabic, the word for submission to the will of God is Islam. And so Muhammad called his teaching Islam because of that. He told his followers that they must fight for this teaching and be victorious. He also said it is no sin to kill unbelievers who refuse to recognize Muhammad as the prophet. And he also taught that warriors who die fighting for the faith go to heaven, where they have all kinds of rewards, while unbelievers and cowards go to hell, where they face eternal torment. In his preaching, Muhammad told his followers of his visions and revelations, which were later written down to become the Quran, which can be spelled two different ways, as you'll see in the notes. One of these teachings promised a heaven filled with luxury, which must have had a profound effect on these tribespeople living in the scorching desert heat, and this must have made them willing to fight and die in order to be admitted to heaven. We'll turn now to page 3 of the notes. The inhabitants of Medina attacked Mecca to avenge their prophet's forced flight and to loot caravans. They triumphed at first, and they carried off rich spoils, but then they lost it all again. The people of Mecca advanced on Medina, intending to lay siege to the town, but they were forced to withdraw after 10 days. Later, Muhammad, accompanied by 1,500 armed men, made a pilgrimage, which is a religious journey, to Mecca. The people of Mecca now came to recognize Muhammad as a mighty prophet, and many joined him. Soon Muhammad and his army had conquered the whole town. He spared the inhabitants, but he discarded the idols that were in the shrine. His power and prestige grew immense, and messengers came from camps and oases far away to pay honor to him. Shortly before his death, he preached before a gathering of 40,000 pilgrims, and he insisted to them that there was no God but Allah, and that he, meaning Muhammad, was his prophet. And he said that the fight against unbelievers must go on. He also urged them to pray 5 times a day, facing Mecca, to drink no wine or alcohol, and to be brave. And so shortly after this, he died, which was the year 632. The Arabs obeyed their prophet's words to fight and kill unbelievers, while all the non-Muslims in their desert had, when all the non-Muslims in their desert had been either killed or converted, they moved on to nearby countries under the leadership of Muhammad's representatives, known as caliphs. And there were 2 of them, Abu Bakr and Omar. Within 6 years of Muhammad's death, the Arab warriors had made bloody conquests of Palestine and Persia, and they had gathered great quantities of loot. Other armies attacked Egypt, which was still part of the Roman Empire of the East, though it had become impoverished by this time. Egypt fell in 4 years, and that included the great city of Alexandria. Now sadly, this great library at Alexandria that had 700,000 scrolls written by Greek poets, writers, and philosophers was destroyed. And so this precious collection of books was lost to us forever. The Arab Empire grew stronger, even stronger than this, and it began to spread in all directions from Mecca. But at this time, the Arabs were far from being united. Several caliphs were chosen to succeed Omar after his death, and they fought against each other. But from around the year 670, Arab armies made repeated attempts to conquer Constantinople, but the inhabitants put up a heroic defense, and they withstood a siege for 7 years until the enemy finally withdrew. The Arabs then attacked Cyprus and Sicily by way of Africa. And they further crossed over Africa into Spain, where the Visigoths had long been dominant. After a battle lasting 7 days, the Arabs were victorious and gained control of Spain. From there, they reached the kingdom of the Franks, where they were confronted by bands of Christian German peasant warriors. The leader of the Franks was Charles Martel, which means the hammer. That's a picture of Charles Martel. And Charles Martel succeeded in defeating the Arabs in the year 732. If he had lost, the Arabs likely would have conquered all of what is now France and Germany and destroyed the monasteries. And this would have meant that many European peoples and their descendants would have become Muslim rather than being Christian. And they may also have affected those that came to the United States, and so there might be a much bigger, greater percentage of Muslims throughout Europe and the U.S. today if that had happened. However, not all Arabs continued to be wild desert warriors. After the battles reduced a little, they began to learn from the people they had defeated and converted in all their conquered lands. They learned the eastern splendor of the Persians, including the enjoyment of fine rugs and textiles, great buildings, wonderful gardens, and precious furnishings and decorated ornaments. We'll turn to page 4 in the notes. Now, in order to erase all traces of the worship of idols, Muslims were forbidden to make images of people or animals. So they decorated their palaces and mosques with beautiful interlacing patterns of lines of many colors that came to be known as arabesques. The Arabs also learned from the Greeks to read and collect books. They particularly liked the writings of Aristotle, who was the teacher of Alexander the Great, and they translated into Arabic these writings. From Aristotle, they learned to concern themselves with everything in nature and to investigate the origins of all things. They took to these intellectual pursuits with enthusiasm, and so they became, over time, or at this time, they became overall more educated than most of the peoples in Europe. They developed sciences. The names of many of these sciences actually come from Arabic, including the terms chemistry and algebra. The Arabs also developed the production of paper, which they had learned from Chinese prisoners of war. Other important things that come from the Arabs are the wonderful tales collected in 1001 Nights, also known as Arabian Nights. The most famous of these is probably the tale of Aladdin, and that's become well known to us because of Disney, the Disney movies. But probably more importantly, they developed Arabic numbers, the numbers 1 through 10, which you put together to make other multiple numbers, such as the number 12. These are much easier to calculate, or to use for calculation, than the Roman numerals. So the Roman number 12 is XII versus the Arabic number is 12. So Arabic numbers have place value, the value given to a number based on its position. For example, in the number 10, 1 is in the 10 position, but in the number 100, 1 is in the 100 position. So we owe this invention of these kinds of numbers to the Arabs, and they themselves learned it from the Indians. So though Charles Martel's defeat of the Arabs in 732 saved European civilization as we have come to know it, the conquests leading to the Arab Empire enabled the Arabs to bring together the ideas and discoveries of the Persians, the Greeks, the Indians, and even the Chinese. Now we'll move on to chapter 21, a conqueror who knows how to rule. This refers to this man named Charlemagne, or that may also be pronounced Charlemagne, but I'll just say Charlemagne for simplicity's sake. Now it may seem that it was easy to conquer the world or build a great empire, given that it happened so often in the history of the world. In fact, in earlier times it was easier. It was much easier then than it would be today. One of the reasons for this is the lack of news, information available to people, most of whom did not even know what was happening in places that were just a few days' journey from where they lived. They stayed in their valleys and forests and tilled the land, and their knowledge of the world ended where neighboring tribes began. These tribes were unfriendly or hostile to them. Each tribe tended to harm other tribes in ways such as raiding cattle and setting fire to farmsteads. Stealing and feuds occurred constantly. Now all people heard of a world, or all that people heard of a world beyond their own, were rumors and hearsay. So they didn't really know much about the outside world. If an army of several thousand men happened to show up, there was little anyone could do to resist or fight them or defend themselves. And if they were not killed, but merely forced to join that army and then to attack their nearest neighbors, they were grateful enough just to be spared and to still be alive. So in this way, armies grew bigger, and a tribe on its own would find it more and more difficult to resist these armies, no matter how bravely it fought. So the Arabs often went about conquests in this way, as did this King Charlemagne, the famous king of the Franks. While conquest was easier than it is today, ruling was actually harder. Messengers had to be sent to distant and inaccessible places, and warring tribes had to be reconciled and made to look beyond old feuds. Good rulers had to help peasants in their misery. People had to be educated, and the thoughts and writings of the past had to be preserved. In those days, a good ruler had to be a sort of father to the vast family of his subjects, and to make all their decisions for them. Let's turn to page 5 of the notes. So this was the sort of ruler that Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great, was. And he was a grandson of Charles Martel, who drove the Arabs out of the kingdom of the Franks. The previous Merovingian dynasty of kings among the Franks were not really good at ruling. They merely repeated the words that their advisors had taught them. So the actual governing was done by an able family to which Charles Martel belonged, as did Charlemagne's father Pepin. But Pepin was not satisfied with being a mere advisor, giving instructions to the king. Since he had the power of kingship, he wanted this title as well. So he overthrew the Merovingian king, and he proclaimed himself king of the Franks. His kingdom covered roughly the western half of what is now Germany and the eastern part of what is now France. However, this was not a settled and well-organized kingdom in a way that was anywhere similar to the Roman Empire, for at this time the population was not united as it had been in the days of the Romans. Instead, there were a number of tribes, all speaking different dialects and having different customs, and whose tolerance of one another was minimal. That meant there was often conflicts among them. So the tribal chieftains were known as dukes, which comes from the Latin word ducere, or to lead, because they marched into battle at the head of the troops. And their lands were known as their duchies. There were a number of these tribal duchies in Germany: the Bavarians, the Swabians, and the Alemanni, among others. The most powerful of all was the Duchy of the Franks, which drew its power from the allegiance that it was owed by other tribes who had to fight on the side of the Franks in times of war. The Frankish supremacy was established in Pepin's time, and Charlemagne would also use it when he became king in the year 768. First, Charlemagne conquered all of France. Then he marched over the Alps to Italy, where the Lombards had settled. He drove out the king of the Lombards and gave control of those lands to the Pope, whose protector he would be throughout his life. Then he marched on to Spain, where he fought the Arabs, but he did not stay there long. After extending his kingdom to the south and west, Charlemagne turned his attention to the east, and there were new hordes of Asiatic warriors called Avars that had invaded the region, now known as Austria. I have a couple of pictures here. All right, I'll come back to this one actually. We have here pictures of first the Avars. We see Charlemagne in both pictures fighting against the Avars and the Saxons. So first the Avars. The Avars were hard to capture because their camps were strongly fortified with rings of ditches. Charlemagne and his armies fought the Avars for 8 years before defeating them thoroughly. However, the Avars' invasion had forced out other tribes, such as the Slavs, who had founded this sort of kingdom, despite its instability, and Charlemagne attacked them too, forcing some to join his army and others to pay tribute. In all his campaigns, he always focused on his goal of bringing the various Germanic tribes and duchies together under his rule and to forge them into a single people. At that time, hardly any of the eastern half of Germany belonged to the kingdom of the Franks. The wild and warlike Saxons you see on the right side lived there in this part of Germany, and they still refused to convert to Christianity. They kept practicing their older heathen religion. So Charlemagne saw himself as the leader of all Christians and thought that you could force people to believe. So he fought with the Saxon chieftain, whose name was Widukind, for many years. The Saxons actually surrendered several times on different occasions, but they would always rebel again as soon as Charlemagne had left. They would also follow Charlemagne into battle, at first seeming to be obedient, but then they would turn around and attack his troops. For their resistance, Charlemagne had more than 4,000 of them put to death. The remaining Saxons allowed themselves to be baptized as Christians, but they probably did not truly accept this Christian faith for a long time. Let's turn to page 6 in the notes. Charlemagne had now grown powerful And not only did he know how to conquer, but he also knew how to govern and take care of his people also. Schools were especially important to him, and he continued to learn throughout his life. And so we see something that I studied about when I was in college was the Carolingian Renaissance that Charlemagne led, where he revived and spread learning throughout his empire. And so we see in this picture that he is being advised by scholars, and he is practicing, trying to keep learning himself, as well as promoting education. So Charlemagne spoke Latin as well as German, or as he spoke German. He also understood Greek. He was interested in all the arts and sciences of antiquity. He took lessons in rhetoric and astronomy from learned monks that were from Italy and England. So he had these educated monks brought to his empire, or his palace, where they would promote education, and he would learn from them, and they would also teach others. Charlemagne also loved hunting and swimming, and generally he dressed simply. Only on special occasions did he wear gold embroidered robes, shoes decorated with gems, a great gold clasp on his cloak, and a gold crown set with precious stones. Ambassadors came to his palace from everywhere, from his own kingdom, which included present-day France, Italy, and Germany, and they also came from the lands of the Slavs and from Austria. Charlemagne kept himself informed about everything that went on in his kingdom, and he made sure his instructions were faithfully carried out. He appointed judges, and he had the laws collected and written down. He nominated church bishops, and he even fixed the price of foods. But what concerned him most was uniting all the Germans. He did not simply want to rule a few tribal duchies, but he wanted to mold them into a single, strong kingdom. Any duke that objected was deposed. And a single German language also took shape throughout these tribes. Because Charlemagne was interested in all things German, he made people write down all the ancient songs about heroes, which probably came from the time of the wars, of the migrations. These stories have almost been lost, and we only know them from versions that were noted down roughly 400 years later. Charlemagne saw himself not only as king of the Germanic peoples and lord of the kingdom of Franks, but also as the defender of all Christians. And the Pope in Rome, who was the leader of the Catholic Church, also enjoyed Charlemagne's protection, and so the Pope agreed with Charlemagne. On Christmas Eve, in the year 800, when Charlemagne was praying in the church of St. Peter's in Rome, the Pope suddenly stepped forward and placed a crown upon his head. Then the Pope and all the people fell on their knees before him and proclaimed Charlemagne the new Roman emperor, chosen by God to preserve the peace of the empire. Charlemagne must have been very surprised, and he apparently did not know that this was going to happen to him. But now he wore the crown, and he was the first German emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, as this land was later known. Charlemagne's mission was to restore the might and grandeur of the old Roman Empire, only this time the rulers would be Christian Germans, who would become the leaders of all Christendom. And this word Christendom is a word that you can kind of see the word for Christianity, but also the word for kingdom. So this means a kind of Christian civilization that developed after Christianity became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire and then in Europe during the Middle Ages. So Charlemagne's ambition was shared by the German emperors who came after him, but none came as close to achieving it as he did. Envoys from all over the world came to his court to pay him homage. Among others, the mighty emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople was anxious to be on good terms with him. So was the great Arab prince Caliph Harun al-Rashid in Mesopotamia. From his palace in Baghdad, which is near ancient Nineveh, this caliph sent precious gifts to Charlemagne. Beautiful robes, rare spices, an elephant, and a water clock that had an amazing mechanism which was unlike anything seen before in the kingdom of the Franks. And for Charlemagne's sake, Harun al-Rashid even let Christian pilgrims visit Christ's tomb in Jerusalem without being harmed. Because at that time, Jerusalem was under Arab rule. And all this was due to the intelligence and superiority of the new emperor. Sadly, that all fell apart after his death in 814, and soon the empire was shared out among Charlemagne's three grandsons in the form of three separate kingdoms of Germany, France, and Italy. Let's turn to page 7 in the notes. In the lands that had once belonged to the Roman Empire, Romance languages continued to be spoken, namely French and Italian. The three kingdoms would never again be united. Even the German tribal duchies rebelled and won back their independence. The Slavs also proclaimed themselves free, and they founded a powerful kingdom under their first great king, Svatopluk. The schools the Charlemagne had founded disappeared, and the art of reading and writing was soon lost to all but a small number of monasteries. Bold Germanic tribes from the north, the Danes and Normans, mercilessly pillaged and plundered coastal cities in their Viking ships. They founded kingdoms in the east among the Slavs and the west on the coast of modern France, which was named Normandy, and it still goes by that name. So before the end of the century, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which was Charlemagne's great achievement, no longer existed or was no more. And now we'll talk about chapter 22 in the book, A Struggle to Become Lord of Christendom. In the history of the world, it's nearly always the unpleasant things that are repeated over and over again. And so it was in a time of chaos, 100 years after Charlemagne's death, that hordes of mounted warriors from the east invaded yet again, as the Avars and Huns had before them. It was easier for them to launch raids on Europe than on China. With the protection of China's Great Wall, China had now become a powerful and well-organized state, with large and prosperous cities where life in the imperial court and in the houses of its educated officials had reached much higher levels of development than elsewhere. This is the tribe of the Magyars that I'll talk about shortly. They were one of these raiding tribes of people from Asia. So in about 800, China was home to some of the greatest poets that the world has ever known. They wrote on silk with brushes dipped in Indian ink, and they wrote concise verses that express so much that they are easily remembered with just one reading of them. Because the Chinese Empire was well administered and protected, the mounted hordes continued to direct their raids toward Europe. This time it was this tribe of the Magyars. Without Pope Leo or Charlemagne to stop them, they easily conquered the lands that are now Austria and Hungary. And they also invaded Germany, seeking to loot and kill this danger forced the independent tribal duchies to elect a common leader. In 919, they chose Henry, Duke of Saxony, to be their king. He eventually succeeded in driving out the Magyars from Germany and keeping them outside the frontiers. His successor, King Otto the Great, in this picture, did not destroy these Magyars completely, as Charlemagne had done with the Avars, but he forced them back into Hungary after a fierce battle in 955, and they have remained there to this day. Otto bestowed the land he had taken from the Magyars on a prince, as was the custom at the time. His son, Otto II, or Otto II, did likewise, bestowing part of present-day Lower Austria on a German nobleman named Leopold. Leopold built himself a castle and ruled over his land like a prince. With the royal grant, he was no longer merely a royal official, but he was lord of his domain. Let's turn to page 8 in the notes. Most of the peasants who lived on these lands were no longer freemen, as German peasants had been in earlier times, but they belonged to the land the king bestowed, or to land owned by a nobleman, and they were known as serfs or bondsmen. Because they were bound to the land, that's where that name comes from, they were not free citizens of the kingdom, and they had neither the right to go where they wished, nor the right to decide whether or not to till their fields. They were obligated to obviously work in their fields. Now, serfs were not exactly slaves because they went with the land, and the land still belonged to the king, even after he had bestowed it on a nobleman. A nobleman was not allowed to sell or kill serfs, as masters once could their slaves, but he could make them carry out his orders. The serfs had to cultivate his land and work for him when he ordered. They had to send regular supplies of bread and meat to the castle for him to eat, because noblemen did not work in the fields. Most of the nobleman's time was spent hunting. The land that the king bestowed on him was known as his fief and would be inherited by his son, as long as he did nothing to offend the king. In return for his fief, all a prince had to do was to take his lords of the manor and his peasants with him into battle to fight for the king during the wars that frequently occurred. At this time, the whole of Germany had been granted in this way to different lords. The king kept little for himself, and the same situation also occurred in France and England. In France, a powerful duke named Hugh Capet became king in the year 987. In 1016, England was conquered by a Danish seafarer named Canute, who ruled over Norway and part of Sweden. He also granted his lands as fiefs to powerful princes. The power of the German kings was greatly increased by their victory over the Magyars. And after defeating the Hungarians, Otto made the Slavic, Bohemian, and Polish princes recognize him as their feudal overlord as well. Thus, they had to consider their own lands as being held in trust for the German king, and they were obliged to bring their armies to his aid in times of war. Otto marched in Italy, where savage fighting had broken out among the Lombards. Otto declared Italy a German fief and bestowed it on a Lombard prince. The Pope then crowned Otto the Roman Emperor in 962, because he was relieved that Otto had been able to gain control of the Lombards. So this sort of resurrected the Holy Roman Empire, but it was not anywhere near as glorious as it was under Charlemagne. So once again, German kings became Roman emperors, and by that title, protectors of Christendom. They owned the land the peasants plowed, from Italy to the North Sea, and from the Rhine to beyond the Elbe River. The emperor frequently bestowed lands on priests and bishops of the church, in addition to noblemen. These priests and bishops also came to rule like noblemen over great estates, and they even rode into battle at the head of their peasant armies. So at first, the situation suited the Pope well. He was on good terms with the German emperors who defended and protected him, and these emperors were all religious men. However, the situation soon changed. The Pope did not want the emperor to decide which of his priests should become a bishop of a specific city, since these were religious appointments. And as leader of the church, the Pope should decide. However, the appointments were in fact more than religious, or not just religious, as the bishops were also essentially princes and lords. Therefore, the emperor maintained that it was for him to decide who was to be a prince or lord in his land. So in a sense, we could say that each side was right. Bestowing land on priests had created a dilemma, since the Pope was head of all priests, while the emperor was lord of all lands. There was a conflict that emerged, and this led to trouble, as we can see in the investiture controversy that occurred between King Henry and Pope Gregory. Let's turn to page 9 in the notes. In the year 1073 in Rome, there was an exceptionally zealous monk who had devoted his life to defending the purity and power of the church, and he became Pope Gregory VII. Meanwhile, in Germany, a Frankish king named Henry IV was on the throne. The Pope saw himself as the divinely appointed ruler of all the Christians on earth, but at the same time, the German emperor, who saw himself as, or was considered a successor to the Roman emperors and to Charlemagne, he saw himself as a protector and supreme commander of the entire Christian world. And so a struggle developed between these two, which caused an uproar throughout the world. Some people were for King Henry, others were for Pope Gregory. Numerous arguments were written, some accusing King Henry of being wicked and hot-tempered. Others accused the Pope of being power-hungry. So, when we hear these kinds of accusations, especially from history, we should not necessarily believe either set of accusations, and we should not believe all the specific details that were written to cast doubt on each person, and these actually matter little to us. We should also note that whenever people take sides about something, they're usually unfair to the other side. And it's especially hard to get at the truth hundreds of years later. So King Henry was in a difficult situation. The nobles on whom he had bestowed land were against him, since they did not want him to become too powerful in case he started ordering them around. Pope Gregory began a confrontation by shutting King Henry out of the church, which means he forbid any priest to offer him Holy Communion, the bread and wine that Christians take to remember Christ's body and blood when he died on the cross. So this was an act known as excommunication. The princes then let it be known that they would have nothing to do with an excommunicated king. And in a sense, at this point, they considered him to not be Christian anymore. And so they were going to choose someone else to take his place. Henry's fate depended on getting the Pope to lift this terrible ban. So he set out for Italy alone without his army to persuade the Pope to lift this ban of excommunication. Now it was winter, and the German princes who wanted to prevent King Henry's reconciliation with the Pope occupied all the roads and paths. Henry had to make a detour. He made his way over the Alps in the freezing cold of winter. But meanwhile, the Pope was on his way to Germany to negotiate with Henry's enemies. When he heard of Henry's approach, he fled and took refuge in a fortress called Canossa in northern Italy, as he was convinced that Henry was arriving with his army and probably would attack him. But when Henry appeared alone, only wishing to have the excommunication lifted, he was amazed, and he was at least relieved. But some reports say that the king came dressed as a penitent, wearing a rough hooded cloak, and that the Pope made him wait 3 days in the castle courtyard, barefoot in the snow, before he took pity on him and lifted the ban. So in this picture we see the Pope in the tower of the castle. We see King Henry down below. Notice that he's barefoot, and apparently this is winter time, and imagine there's snow on the ground. So the people that supported the Pope wanted to emphasize how the king had to humble himself and was humiliated and essentially put to shame through this act that he had to appear before the Pope. But on the other hand, the king's friends saw Henry's plan as a shrewd way for him both to have the Pope lift the excommunication, as well as to prevent the Pope from meeting Henry's enemies, which would have proved a danger to Henry. So the Pope's friends saw Henry's going to Canossa as an outstanding success for the Pope, and the king's supporters saw it as a great triumph for their leader. Again, there's two sides to every story that we can think about. But the struggle did not end at Canossa, or with the death of King Henry or Pope Gregory. Though Henry later managed to have Henry deposed, or Henry later had the Pope deposed, the Pope's desire ultimately prevailed. Bishops from then were chosen by the Church, and the Emperor was only allowed to say if he agreed with the choice. So the Pope, not the Emperor, became the Lord of Christendom. Let's turn to page 10 of the notes. When the Normans conquered a stretch of land along the northern coast of France that is still known as Normandy, they quickly learned to speak French. However, they continued their adventurous sea voyages and conquests. Some went as far as Sicily, where they fought the Arabs, then conquered southern Italy and went on to defend Pope Gregory against Henry's attacks. But others crossed the narrow stretch of sea between France and England that's known as the English Channel, and under their king William, they defeated the British king, or the English king, at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. This is the last time that an enemy army succeeded in setting foot on English soil. So William had his officials draw up a list naming every village and property in the land, many of which he bestowed on his fellow soldiers as fiefs. The English nobility were now Normans, and because these Normans spoke French, the English language is still a mixture of words from Old German and from Romance languages. And now we'll turn to chapter 23. We'll talk about the age of chivalry and especially chivalrous knights. The time of knights is often referred to as the age of chivalry. Here we see a knight on horseback, and a lady looks like she is tying some type of a cloth or a banner to his arm. Now, there are popular stories in this era that feature knights and their squires who set out in search of adventure. They're wearing shining armor and riding noble steeds or horses, and participating in jousting and tournaments where ladies give prizes to the victors. All of these things actually existed, and people took part joyfully in the code of chivalry. In fact, this was often taken with deadly seriousness. This word chivalry comes from the French word chevalier, or similar to the word cavalier, which means horseman. Chivalry began with the horseman. Anyone who could afford a horse on which to ride into battle was, at least in the beginning, a knight. And if he couldn't afford a horse, he went to battle on foot. And he wasn't a knight, that's the only difference, at least initially. Noblemen whose lands had been bestowed on them by the king were also knights, and their serfs had to provide hay for the horses. A nobleman, in his turn, might bestow part of his fief on his agent or a steward, who would also be rich enough to own a fine horse, even if he had little power in other respects. When his lord was summoned to war by the king, he had to ride with him, and so stewards were also knights. And only peasants, poor servants, farmers, and laborers who went to war on foot were not knights, at least in the early stages. So the age of chivalry began around the year 1000 and went on for several centuries in Germany, England, and France. However, the institution of knighthood that we think of developed gradually. First, the princes and nobles set about building themselves great fortresses, which were intended to be secure against all assault. Many of these can still be seen today in hilly places or on high cliffs, with only one approach along a narrow track. So this is a picture of a medieval castle. Now, before you reach the castle gate, there was usually a wide ditch or moat. You can see the moat in this picture. This was sometimes full of water. Over the moat was a drawbridge. This castle may be a little different than that. The drawbridge had chains on each side to haul it up quickly. But when the bridge was raised, the castle was secure and no one could get in. On the other side of the ditch were thick, strong walls with loopholes to shoot arrows and holes for pouring boiling tar down on the enemy. The walls were topped with tooth-like battlements. You can kind of see these towers on the top, and in a sense they're tooth-like. So people could stand on top of these towers to spy on the enemy, and within this thick wall there was often another one, sometimes even a third, before you reached the castle courtyard. The courtyard gave access to the rooms where the knights lived, and then there was also a hall with a fireplace and a fire, which was reserved for the women. It was more comfortable in the women's quarters. But overall, there was nothing really comfortable about life in a castle. The kitchen was a room that was blackened with soot, where meat was roasted on a great spit over a crackling log fire. In addition to the rooms for the knights and their attendants, there were two other rooms. There was a chapel where worship services were held by a chaplain, and there was the keep. The keep was a massive tower, which was generally in the heart of the castle, where stores were usually kept, and in which the knights took refuge if their enemies successfully overcame the mountain, the moat, the drawbridge, boiling tar, and the three walls. So with the defense of this mighty tower, The knights were often able to hold out until help arrived. There were also the dungeons, which were cramped and freezing cells in the depths of the castle, into which knights threw their prisoners. These prisoners were left to suffer in the dark until they died or were ransomed for a vast sum of money. The castles were made by peasant serfs, men deprived of liberty, and it was they who had to split and carry the rocks, hold them up, and pile them on top of each other. And when their strength gave out, their wives and children had to take over. A knight could command them to do anything. Sons of serfs became serfs, and sons of knights became knights, similar to the caste system of ancient India. At the age of 7, a knight's son was sent away to another castle to learn about life. He was called a page, and he had to serve the ladies in that castle. On reaching the age of 14, a page became a squire, and then he was allowed to accompany his knight when he went hunting or went out to war. A squire had to carry his knight's shield and spear and hand him his second lance on the battlefield when the first one shattered. He had to obey his master in all things and be loyal to him. And if he proved brave and loyal, he would be dubbed a knight at the age of 21. The ceremony of dubbing was a solemn one. The squire first had to fast and pray in the castle chapel, and he received communion from the priest. Wearing armor, he would kneel between two witnesses. His lord tapped him on each shoulder and on the neck with the flat blade of his sword. The squire then rose, and he was now a knight, who may then be able to dub other knights. His shield bore his coat of arms, which was a symbol unique to each person or to families. This is an example of a coat of arms. And he also chose a motto to live by. He was solemnly presented with his sword and helmet. Golden spurs were attached to his boots, and his shield was set on his arm. He then rode off, and his bright-adorned helmet with his lance and cloak over his chainmail armor. He was accompanied by his own squire, and he went to prove himself worthy of his knighthood. As the institution of knighthood developed, a knight was something more than just a soldier on horseback. He was almost a member of an order, like a monk. Just as a monk served God through prayers and good works, a knight served God through his strength. It was his duty to protect the weak and defenseless, women and the poor, and widows and orphans. He was only allowed to draw his sword in a just cause, and he must serve God in every deed. He owed absolute obedience to his master, known as his liege lord. He must risk all for him. He must be neither brutal nor cowardly, and must only fight man to man in battle, never 2 against 1, or he and a companion against just one person. And a vanquished opponent must never be humiliated. So this type of behavior is still called chivalrous, because it conforms to the knight's ideal. When a knight loved a lady, he did battle in her honor, and he went in search of adventures to win fame for his beloved. He pronounced her name with reverence and did everything that she asked. That's also part of the code of chivalry. So a remnant of this type of thinking exists in customs that we think of as being gentlemanly, or things that gentlemen do, like letting a lady go through the door first, or picking up something that she has dropped. Let's turn to page 12 in the notes. In peacetime, a knight would demonstrate their courage and skill and games of chivalry known as tournaments. And the big part of that was jousting, which you see in this picture. Knights from many countries gathered to test their strength at these types of war games. Dressed in armor, they galloped toward each other. Each one was attempting to unhorse the other one, or knock the other one off the horse, with a blunted lance. The lady of the castle presented the winner with a prize, which was usually a garland of flowers. To please the ladies, a knight also had to behave in a noble manner, not cursing as soldiers usually did. And the knight also had to master the art of playing chess, poetry, and other arts of peace. Knights were often, in fact, great poets who wrote songs praising the women that they loved, telling of their beauty and virtue. They also sang of the deeds of other knights of the past. There were long stories and verse telling of legends such as King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and their quest for the Holy Grail, which was the legendary cup that Christ drank from at the Last Supper. And there were even stories about Alexander the Great and the Greek stories about the Trojan War. Minstrels wandered from castle to castle, singing about other legendary figures, such as Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, which is told in the Song of the Nibelungen, as well as Theodoric, King of the Goths, that we talked about last week. These songs, which were sung in Austria on the Danube at the time, are among the earliest songs that we know currently. A knight's duty now was to fight for God and for Christendom, and they found an opportunity to do so when they sought to help liberate Christ's tomb in Jerusalem, along with the whole of Palestine, which was in the hands of the Arab Muslims. So, when they were reminded of their duty by a preacher in France and by the Pope, who had become the mightiest ruler of Christendom at this time, tens of thousands of Christian knights cried out enthusiastically, "It is God's will!" And that begins the Crusades. Under the leadership of a French knight named Godfrey of Bouillon, a great army set off along the Danube in the year 1096, first to Constantinople and then on through Asia Minor toward Palestine. These knights and their followers had crosses of red material stitched to their shoulders, and you see crosses on their shields. They were called Crusaders. Their aim was to liberate the land where Christ had lived and died. After long years of battles and hardships, they finally reached the walls of Jerusalem, and it's said that they were so moved by the sight of the holy city that they wept and kissed the soil. Then they besieged the town and eventually took it or conquered it, even though it had been bravely defended by Arab soldiers. Once inside Jerusalem, however, they behaved neither like knights nor like Christians. In other words, they did not behave honorably. They massacred all the Muslims, and they committed horrible acts of violence. But then they did penance, singing psalms and walking barefoot to Christ's tomb, humbling themselves and hoping that God would forgive the deeds of war they had done, or even the acts of massacre. The Crusaders founded the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem with Godfrey of Bouillon as its protector, but it was small and weak and far from Europe, and it was in the midst of Muslim kingdoms. So the state suffered numerous attacks from Arab warriors, and this meant that priests in England, France, and Germany continued to urge knights to go on new crusades. Not all of these were successful. Let's turn to page 13 in the notes. So the Crusades are a dark period in history. So Christians today, as well as people with European heritage, are often ashamed of this kind of legacy in the way that it came to represent Christians and Europeans. However, one good thing that came from these crusades are that the Christians discovered Arab culture in the distant Orient. They discovered their buildings, their sense of beauty, and their learning. Within 100 years of the First Crusades, the writings of Aristotle were translated from Arabic into Latin and were eagerly read and studied in Italy, France, Germany, and England. People were surprised to find how similar many of Aristotle's teachings were to those of the church, and they filled large Latin volumes with complicated thoughts on this subject. All that the Arabs had learned and experienced was now brought back to Europe by the Crusaders. So in a number of ways, we can see that it was the example of those that they looked on as enemies, namely the Arabs, that actually transformed these barbaric warriors of Europe into being truly chivalrous knights. Okay, let's go ahead and start the next chapter, 24, Emperors in the Age of Chivalry. We'll cover part of this today and the rest next week. So in these times, there was a new family of knights ruling in Germany, and they took the name Hohenstaufen from their castle. One of them was the Emperor Frederick, who was nicknamed Barbarossa by the Italians, which refers to his red beard, as you can see in the picture. And he was named by this Italian name because of the amount of time that he spent in Italy and the famous deeds that he did there. He was determined to rule the whole of Italy because he needed the money, and there was little money in Germany in those days. The serfs cultivated their fields and gave a tenth of their harvest to the knights and monks who owned the land, and they gained their tools and farm equipment through exchange. If a peasant had an ox, but would rather have 6 sheep for wool to make a jacket, he would make an exchange with his neighbor. If he had slaughtered an ox and turned the horns into drinking cups, he could exchange one of the cups for some flax grown by his neighbor, which his wife could then weave into a coat. This process is known as barter. So in those days, people in Germany managed to get by without money. Most of them were either peasants or landowners. They did not really need money. And the monasteries also owned a lot of land, which was given to them by pious people or as an inheritance when people died. And thus they didn't need money either. So apart from vast forests, small villages, and castle monasteries, there was little in the whole German kingdom. There were hardly any towns, and it was only in the towns that people needed money, because towns were full of people such as shoemakers, cloth merchants, and scribes, and it would be unimaginably complicated for these people to practice the barter system. That's why they decided on something to exchange that everyone would want and accept. Something that was easy to share and carry around, and that would not go bad or lose its value, like food or clothing that would eventually wear out. So it was decided that the best thing would be metal, namely gold or silver. All money was once made of metal, and rich people went around with purses full of gold coins. A man could use money to pay the shoemaker for shoes, and the shoemaker could use it to buy bread from the baker. The baker could then give it to the peasant in exchange for flour, and the peasant could use it to buy a plow. Now, while there were few towns in Germany, money had been used in Italy since the time of the Roman Empire. Italy had always had great cities and many merchants with bags of money on their belts, and even more money stored in great chests. Let's turn to page 14. Some of these towns were by the sea, like Venice, which is on a cluster of little islands in the sea, where the inhabitants had taken refuge from the Huns. And there were other great harbor towns, such as Genoa and Pisa, whose ships sailed far across the seas and came back from the Orient with fine cloth, rare spices, and weapons of great value. These goods were sold off in the ports, to be sold again inland in cities like Florence, Verona, or Milan, where the cloth might be made into clothing, banners, or tents. And these were then sent to France, whose capital city of Paris already contained almost 100,000 inhabitants. Or they were sent to England or Germany, though not much really went to Germany since there was little money to pay for such things. Now, people who lived in towns grew richer, and no one could give them orders because they didn't belong to anyone's fief. But they were not lords, since no one had granted them land. So they governed themselves and had their own courts of law. They were as free and independent in their cities as the monks and the knights. Such citizens were known as the third estate, also known as the bourgeoisie. As the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa wanted to be the actual ruler of Italy and to receive tribute and taxes from Italian citizens. But the Italian citizens were used to their freedom and did not want to give it up. So Barbarossa took an army over the Alps to Italy, where he summoned a number of famous jurists in the year 1158, who publicly declared that as Holy Roman Emperor and successor to the Roman Caesars, he had all the rights of his predecessors 1,000 years before. The Italian cities did not recognize this decision, and they still refused to pay. So the emperor led his army against them, and in particular against the town of Milan, which was at the heart of the rebellion. And it said that he was so angry that he swore not to wear his crown until he had forced the town into submission. Only after he had utterly destroyed Milan did he hold a banquet at which he and his wife appeared with their crowns on their heads once more. But no matter how many great and successful campaigns that he led, beginnings of revolt always began to stir whenever he left Italy to return home. The Milanese people rebuilt their town, and they still refused to recognize a German ruler. So Barbarossa led a total of 6 campaigns against Italy, but his success was always limited or never final. On the other hand, Barbarossa was seen to be the very model of a knight. He was extremely strong, both physically and mentally. He was also generous, and he knew how to hold a great feast. In those days, a feast was a lavish and magnificent occasion. Barbarossa held such a feast in Mainz when his sons were dubbed knights in 1181. 40,000 knights were invited to the feast, with their attendants and their squires. They stayed in brightly colored tents, with the emperor himself having the grandest one in the center of the encampment. Fires blazed around with whole oxen, wild boars, and countless chickens roasting on spits over the fires. People came from far and wide, dressed in all sorts of costumes. And there were jugglers, and acrobats, and minstrels who sang all the great songs of old in the evening while they feasted. The emperor and his sons displayed their jousting skills while all the nobles in the land looked on. This type of feast went on for days, and minstrels continued to sing about it long after it was over. Barbarossa eventually went on one of the Crusades in the year 1189, which was the Third Crusade. King Richard, the Lionheart of England, and the French King Philip also took part in this crusade, traveling by sea, but Barbarossa chose to go by land. However, ironically, he drowned in a river in Asia Minor. Alright, we will continue the story next week with his descendant who took over after him. I want to give you the optional viewing, or the suggested viewing for this week, which is episode 5 of Mankind, the Story of Us. The episode is called Plague. If you choose to watch this episode of the Mankind series, you can see the Mongols, who are led by Genghis Khan, attacking China. The Mongol Empire becomes the largest empire in human history as it's strengthened by a successful communication system. We also see the spread of the bubonic plague, both to China and to Europe, but it's especially devastating to the very dense population of Europe. And there's an example of one Mongol warlord that even uses the plague to launch a kind of biological warfare. Sadly, there's an example of a German town during the plague that is ruled by suspicion. We see a lot of suspicion during this time, and so they blame the Jews for the plague, and that leads to 1,000 Jews being burned alive. But yet the plague continues, and great cities in Europe are deserted. And then finally in the episode, we see the great Inca civilization in the Americas, where 90 million people lived that were isolated from the rest of the world. And the Incas develop a form of agriculture that adapts to the high altitude of the Andes Mountains. And they build the largest empire in the Americas, which includes most of the modern day regions of Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. Now, once again, let me emphasize the homework assignment. This is very important that you do this. Write at least one paragraph to reflect on something you've learned from this lesson this week. And again, it should be from this week, so don't write to me about topics from previous weeks like Egypt or ancient Greece or the Roman Empire. It should be something specifically from this lesson. And make some attempts, ideally, to relate it to your life, either how your life is affected by the events, or if there are lessons you can learn. Please note that you should write these reflections in your own words, and you should not just copy from the notes. The weekly homework assignment, again, is necessary to count for class attendance. And if you do not do this assignment, you do not get attendance for credit for the class. So please email me with this assignment. And let's turn to the final page in the notes where I talk about the primary text 3, which is about the Crusades. This gives you both the account of a Christian and the account of 2 Muslims about the Crusades. So read through these texts. If you want to do this extra credit assignment, read through the texts carefully and answer the following questions and submit this to me by email. So the 3 questions are, number 1, in what ways were Christian and Muslim accounts of the Crusades similar? How might each side praise the other? Number 2, how did the Christian account try to stir up Christians against the way that Muslims treated the Christian faith or religion? And how did the Muslim accounts try to stir up Muslims against Christian scorn for Islam? And number 3, what were the similarities and differences in the Christian and Muslim hatred toward one another that occurred during this time of the Crusades? So that is the extra credit question. You get 5 points if you complete that and submit it to me. And I was going to mention one more option for the homework assignment. Well, 2 more options. One, you can write about the Crusades. You can also write about Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance, because I wrote a paper about that many years ago. That's an interesting topic. But again, it's if you wish to get credit for the paper, then the topic is up for your decision. Choose whatever you want. I'm just giving you some ideas if you can't think of anything on your own. So once again, if you need to contact me, please feel free to email me. I'm also at the school full-time, so you can call the school if you want to talk to me. I'm available. Other than that, I give you all blessings this week. We'll see you next week. Take care, be safe, and stay healthy. Goodbye.